Hello viewers, in the last session we looked at the interesting story of Oliver Twist written by Charles Dickens. Now in this session we will look at different themes, symbols and literary devices used by Charles Dickens to paint the picture of Oliver Twist, the society and the different characters. Charles Dickens was born in 1812 at Landport, England, where his father was the clerk in the Navy Pay Office. The family moved to London in 1815 and later to Chatham. During this time, Dickens was enjoying life, but in 1823 they returned to London with their waning fortunes. The debts pushed his father behind the bars, and the Dickens was out of the school and was forced to work in blacking warehouse of one of his relatives. So we understand this novel is dominated by autobiographical elements. When their finances improved, however, he went back to school until he left again at 15. He began his literary career in 1833 when he was 21 years old by publishing his stories in newspapers and magazines. In 1836, he began doing serial publications, first with Pickwick Papers and then Oliver Twist. This is an important point. He married Catherine Hogarth and later became the father of 10 children by her. Dickens continued to publish his work in weekly installments or monthly parts depending on the publication. Dickens remained a prolific writer to the end of his life, and his novels among them are Great Expectations, A Tale of Two Cities, A Christmas Carol, David Copperfield and Bleak House. He continued to earn critical and popular acclaim. He died of stroke in 1870 at the age of 58 and leaving the mystery of Edwin Drood unfinished. Very interesting biography of Charles Dickens. Oliver Twist opens with a bitter criticism aimed at the 19th century English poor laws. These laws were a hazy picture of the Victorian middle class emphasis on the virtues of hard work. England in the 1830s was rapidly undergoing a transformation from an agricultural economy to an industrial nation. The growing middle class was competing with British aristocracy. In the 1830s, the middle class hollered for political power, with the landed gentry bringing a change in the voting system. Parliament passed the Reform Act, which granted the right to vote to previously disenfranchised middle class citizens. The desire to gain social legitimacy gave rise to evangelical religious movement and inspired sweeping economic and political change. The middle class promoted work as virtue, but it resulted in English society subjecting the poor to hatred and cruelty. The middle class value system transformed earned wealth into a sign of moral virtue. Victorian society interpreted individual efforts and economic success as sign and poverty as vice. The sentiment behind the Poor Law of 1834 reflected these beliefs. The law allowed the poor to receive public assistance only if they lived and worked in established workhouses. The philosophy was that the miserable conditions would prevent able-bodied paupers from being lazy and idle bums. In the eyes of middle-class English society, those who were idle and dependent were considered as immoral and evil. Concisely, the state played the role of surrogate parents of workhouse children, whether or not they were orphans. Inadequate basic facilities were deliberate. The workhouse was supposed to demonstrate the virtue of gainful employment to the poor. Victorian values stressed the moral virtue of suffering and privation. Let me remind you, we are looking at the societal background or the backdrop against which the Dickens wrote his novel. Dickens meant to demonstrate this absurdity through the figure of Oliver Twist, an orphan born and raised in a workhouse. Dickens goes far beyond the experiences of the workhouse, extending his depiction of poverty to London's squalid streets, dark alehouses, and thieves' dens. He gave voice to those who had no voice, establishing a link between politics and literature with his social commentary. Oliver Twist is born in a workhouse in 1830s in England. His mother, whose name no one knows, is found on the street and dies just after Oliver's birth. Oliver spends the first 9 years of his life in an orphanage and is then transferred to a workhouse which was meant for adults. Mr. Bumble, unable to accommodate Oliver, offers £5 to anyone who will take the boy away from the workhouse. Desperate, Oliver runs away at dawn and travels towards London. Outside London, Oliver, starved and exhausted, meets Jack Dawkins, a boy of his own age. He introduces Oliver to a criminal Fagin who trains orphan boys to pickpocket for him. Horrified Oliver escapes exhausted and is nursed by Mr. Brownlow. Mr. Brownlow is struck by Oliver's resemblance to a portrait of a young woman that hangs in his house. Oliver thrives in Mr. Brownlow's home, but two young adults in Fagin's gang, Bill Sykes and his lover Nancy, capture Oliver and return him to Fagin. Fagin sends Oliver to assist Sykes in a burglary. Oliver is shot by a servant of the house, and after Sykes escapes, is taken in by the women who live there, Mrs. Maylie and her beautiful adopted niece Rose. Oliver lives a decent life, but Fagin and a mysterious man named Monks are set on recapturing Oliver. Meanwhile, it is realized that Oliver's mother left behind a gold locket when she died. Monks obtains and destroys that locket. When the Maylies come to London, Nancy meets secretly with Rose and informs her of Fagin's designs, and a member of the gang discloses this to Sykes, and he brutally murders Nancy, but at the end inadvertently hangs himself while trying to escape. Mr. Brownlow and Maylies are reunited with Oliver and tackle Monks and dig for the truth about Oliver's parentage, and also realize that Monks is Oliver's half-brother. Their father, Mr. Leaford, married a wealthy woman and who also had an affair with Oliver's mother, Agnes Fleming. Monks always sees to it that Oliver is deprived of family inheritance. But Mr. Brownlow forces Monks to sign over Oliver's share. Moreover, it is discovered that Rose is Agnes' younger sister, hence Oliver's aunt. Fagin is hung for his crimes. Finally, Mr. Brough adopts Oliver and the Maylies retire to a blissful existence in the countryside. As a child protagonist of the melodramatic novel of social protest, Oliver Twist impresses our literary sensibilities. Oliver, as a character, keeps his virtues and values intact although he is raised in corrupt surroundings. According to Dickens, paupers and criminals are already evil at birth and not because of the corrupt society. At the same time, Oliver's incorruptibility undermines some of the Dickens assertions. Oliver unknowingly enters the profession of pickpocketing and is shocked to know that he is forced to participate in a burglary. Oliver has inherent decency. Though he keeps the company of criminals, his values and his King's English is intact. His grammatical preciseness is also enigmatic, as Oliver presumably is not well educated. Oliver is not torn between good and evil, but symbolizes goodness itself. Even if we might feel that Dickens' social criticism would have been more effective if he had focused on a more complex poor character like the artful dodger or Nancy, the audience for whom Dickens was writing might not have been receptive to such a portrayal. Dickens' Victorian middle class readers were likely to hold opinions on the poor that were only a little less extreme than those expressed by Mr. Bumble, the beadle who treats paupers with great cruelty. In fact, Oliver Twist was condemned for portraying thieves and prostitutes. Given the strict morals of Dickens' audience, it may have seemed necessary for him to make Oliver a saint-like figure, because Oliver as a character attracted Victorian readers' sentiments, and his story may have stood a better chance of effectively challenging their unfairness. Next important character is Nancy. A major concern of Oliver Twist is the question of whether a polluted environment can eternally poison someone's character and soul. As the novel progresses and evolves, the character who best illustrates the conflicting issues brought up by that question is Nancy. As a child of the streets, Nancy has been a thief and drinks to excess. The narrator's reference to her free and agreeable manners indicates that she is a prostitute. She indulges in the vices condemned by her society, but she also sits on the high pedestal by committing the most noble act in the novel when she sacrifices her own life in order to protect Oliver. Nancy's moral complication stands out among the major characters in Oliver Twist. The novel is full of characters who are all good and can barely comprehend evil, such as Oliver, Rose and Brownlow, and characters who are all evil can barely understand good, such as Fagin, Sykes and Monks. Only Nancy is capable of comprehending good and evil. Her ultimate choice to do good at a great personal cost is a strong argument in favor of the virtue of basic goodness, no matter how many environmental challenges it may face. Nancy's love for Sykes epitomizes the moral ambiguity of her character, as she herself points out to Rose that devotion to a man can be a comfort and a pride under the right circumstances. But for Nancy, such devotion is an eternal suffering. Indeed, her relationship with Sykes makes her a criminal and eventually her own demise. The same behavior in different circumstances can have very different consequences and moral significance. In much of Oliver Twist, morality and nobility are black and white issues, but Nancy's character suggests that the boundary between a virtue and a vice is always hazy. Another villainous character of this novel is Fagin. Although Dickens denied that his hatred against Jews had influenced his portrait of Fagin, The Jewish thief's characterization does seem to reflect the same. The frequent usage of two words, the Jew, prove again. However, Fagin is more than a statement of ethnic prejudice. He is a richly drawn character and symbolizes terrifying villainy. At times, he seems like a child's fuzzy vision of pure evil. Other characters occasionally refer to him as the Old One, a popular nickname for the devil. Oliver encounters him in the hazy zone between sleep and waking, at the precise time when dreams and nightmares are born from the mere silent presence of some external object. Indeed, Fagin is meant to inspire nightmares in child and adult readers alike. The gallows and the fear they inspire in Fagin are like ghosts that are even more horrifying to contemplate than Fagin himself. The first one is mistaken identities. The plot of Oliver Twist revolves around many pseudo-identities that other characters inflict upon Oliver, often for the sake of materializing their own interests. Mr. Bumble and the other workhouse staff portray Olive as ungrateful, immoral pauper. Monks does his best to claim Oliver's rightful inheritance. Character also disguise their own identities when it serves them well to do so. Nancy pretends to be Oliver's middle-class sister in order to get him back to Fagin, while Monks changes his name and poses as a common criminal rather than the age he really is. Scenes depicting the manipulation of clothing indicate how it plays an important part in the construction of various characters' identities. Nancy dons new clothing to pass as a middle-class girl, and Fagin strips Oliver of all his upper-class credibility when he takes from him the suit of clothes purchased by Brownlow. The novel's role revolves around the revelation of the real identities of Oliver, Rose and Monks. Only when every character's identity is known with certainty does the story achieve a meaningful conclusion. The novel also gives immense importance to family relationships, though they are veiled. The exposure of Oliver's familial ties is among the novel's most unlikely plot turns. Oliver is related to Brownlow, who was married to his father's sister, to Rose, who is his aunt, and to Monks, who is his half-brother. The coincidences involved in these facts are quite astonishing and represents the novel's rejection of realism in favor of fantasy. Oliver is at first believed to be an orphan without parents or relatives, a position that would in that time and place almost certainly seal his doom. Yet, by the end of the novel, it is revealed that he has more relatives than just about anyone else in the novel. This reversal of fortunes strongly resembles the fulfillment of a naive child's wish. It also suggests the mystical binding power of a family or family relationships. Brownlow and Rose take to Oliver immediately, even though he is implicated in an attempted robbery of Rose's house, while Monks recognizes Oliver the instant he sees him on the street. The influence of blood ties, it seems, can be felt even before anyone knows those ties exist. Another important motive is surrogate families. Before Oliver finds his real family, a number of individuals serve him as foster parents with no parental instinct. Mrs. Mann and Mr. Bumble are surrogate parents, though horribly careless ones, for the huge number of orphans under their care. Mr. Sowerberry and his wife, while far from ideal, are much more serviceable parent figures to Oliver. And it comes as a surprise that Oliver becomes a responsible citizen under their care. Interestingly, it is the mention of his real mother that leads to Oliver's rejection of the Sowerberrys. The most provocative of the novel's mock family structures is the unit formed by Fagin and his young charges. Fagin provides and trains his wards nearly as well as a father might, and he inspires enough loyalty in them that they stick around after they are grown. But these quasi-familial relationships are built primarily around ill will and exploitation and not out of true concern. Oddly enough, the only satisfactory surrogate parents Oliver finds are Brownlow and Rose, both of whom turn out to be actual relatives. Next important motif is Oliver's face. It is singled out for special attention at multiple points in the novel. Mr. Sowerberry, Charles Bates, Toby Crackit all comment on its particular appeal and its similarity to the portrait of Agnes Fleming, which provides the first clue to Oliver's identity. The power of Oliver's physiognomy, combined with the facts that Fagin is repulsive and Rose is beautiful, suggests that in the world of the novel, external appearance usually gives a fair impression of a person's inner character. Symbolism is equally rich, and the names of the characters are interesting. The names of characters exhibit personal qualities. Oliver Twist himself is the most obvious example. The name Twist, though accidental, alludes to the offensive reversals of fortune that he will experience. Rose Maylie's name echoes her connect with flowers and springtime, youth and beauty. Toby Crackit's name is a reference that suits his profession, theft. Mr. Bumble's name connotes a clumsy conceit. Mrs. Mann's lack of maternal instinct and Mrs. Grimwig's shallow grimness that can be removed as easily as a wig. Bill Sykes' dog, Bull's Eye, has faults of temper in common with his owner and symbolizes his owner's character. The dog's ferocity reflects and represents Sykes' own animal-like brutality. After Sykes murders Nancy, Bull's Eye comes to represent Sykes' guilt. The dog leaves bloody footprints on the floor of the room where the murder is committed. Not long after, Sykes becomes desperate to get rid of the dog, convinced that the dog's presence will give him away. Yet, just as Sykes cannot get rid of his guilt, he cannot get rid of Bull's Eye, who appears at the house of Sykes' death before Sykes himself does. Bull's Eye name also invokes the image of Nancy's eyes, which haunts Sykes until the bitter end and eventually causes him to hang himself accidentally. Nancy's decision to meet Brownlow and Rose on London Bridge reflects the symbolic aspect of this bridge in Oliver Twist. And that's how he concludes with this bridge. The conclusion sounds a little philosophical. Bridges exist to connect two places that would otherwise be separated by an uncrossable rift. The meeting on London Bridge symbolizes the collision of two worlds unlikely ever to come into contact. The idyllic world of Brownlow and Rose and the atmosphere of degradation in which Nancy lives. On the bridge, Nancy is given the chance to cross over to the better way of life that the others represent, but she rejects that opportunity and by the time the three have all left the bridge, that possibility has vanished forever. The writer concludes this novel with a message that we should learn from the different opportunities provided by the divine and then enjoy the life. I hope you got this message clearly, and thank you for listening.